Welcome to the Urban Agenda, a public affairs show sponsored by the Community Service Society. I'm David R. Jones, its president and chief executive officer. Today we'll talk about your child's education. New York City's public schools are charged with educating over 1 million students, the vast majority children of color. School buildings are crumbling, textbooks and equipment are outdated, student disputes erupt into violence. Add to this mix City Hall's budget cuts and you have a critical situation. How are children supposed to learn in this kind of atmosphere? Let's turn for some answers to Schools Chancellor Rudy Crew. Dr. Crew, having run the Tacoma, Washington and Sacramento, California schools, what makes New York City so tough?
Well, it's interesting. In your prologue, you identify some of the major issues, and obviously there are tensions that are associated with each one of those issues, not the least of which is really sort of, recovering from many years, frankly, where people have divested in their expenditures in public schools. So what makes it tough is that you are trying to do it on a very, very shifting base, and of course just simply having to work people through and get consensus around what to do and how to do it is always a tough.
Now, do you think that part of the difficulty we're having is the students being served? Is it because there's so many children of color in this system that it makes it a much more difficult political lift?
I think that this is a case of people having to reconnect to the need for a school system to be a place where all children are educated. And there are many people who would argue that, that because there are so few people who actually live in and who send their children to public schools, particularly as politicians, that this is really not their issue anymore, that this is really a case of just a population of youngsters that now inhabit urban America, and in effect, we can just educate them almost in the by and by. I don't think that's the case of the majority of people. That's certainly not my feeling, and I think that now it's a matter of saying, regardless of who's here, regardless of what language they speak, regardless of what countries they come from, what their ethnicity is, we got to get this thing fixed.
Well, as we go out as advocates and the rest, we run into more and more individuals, both as policymakers and politicians, who say that no matter how much money you give to the system, it's just too messed up to be reformed, that it's a waste of money to try to get more money into the educational system. What is your answer to that as it goes on?
I think that is such an easy, cynical voice that I reject it, in part because it simply is not true. It does take money to be able to educate children, to provide for them the same kind of substantive, valuable education and access to post-secondary and world of work opportunities that other children have. But also, I think that we've spent a decade or more really rolling out all of the cynics and having them talk about what's wrong. And I think now it becomes, frankly, incumbent upon all of us to now start talking about what's right and how do we focus those dollars and focus those energies on creating a different system. And it will look very different from what we have right now. Classrooms should look very different. Schools should look very different. The school day would look very different. How you use summer would look very different. So it becomes important to galvanize people around programmatic change and then help them to see that there are some models that frankly have already been out there that we should be replicating, and that it's important you're going to have to pay for this. This is not something you're going to be able to do on the cheap.
Now, I know that there's a new proposal for further cuts in your budget, and I know that you're trying to cope with those with the least impact on the classroom. How is that going? How is this new reality going to hit the classroom and children and the people who are trying to work in the system?
Frankly, if we don't spare districts, schools, and classrooms, you'll see a greater acceleration, frankly, of loss of quality and loss of instruction and loss of opportunities for kids in the classroom. I think that we have been able so far to have a dialogue with certainly our own local officials and certainly my own board, but also with City Hall, with Albany, to really try to focus on the fact that this is no longer a question, really, it's not even a partisan issue. Mm-hmm. It's really now a question of how serious are you about the economic viability of the city of New York, and how serious are we about education fitting into that viability picture. And I think people really recognize that we're at a point where it's going to have to either turn around and you're going to have to spend some money, and we're going to have to hold on to what we do have and protect the classroom from any more cuts, or we can continue to hit it, and you will raise class size, you will frankly lower the kind of schooling, the quality of schooling that we're offering children. And in so doing, you'll preside over the demise of a school system.
This goes directly, the Regent of the state of New York has just announced that it's recommending higher standards for graduation. Isn't this a contradiction when we're losing resources for particularly poor and minority kids? And from a little work we've done, finding that there are fewer and fewer certified and highly skilled professionals teaching in these neighborhoods, to start raising standards when we don't have the kind of wherewithal and teaching supports to really have a minority child or a poor child meet those standards?
I don't think that it's a contradiction. I think that this fits the mode of being a stretch target. And I think we've got to have in this institution, we've got to have stretch targets. Where are we? What are we moving toward? But by the same token, as one might set those targets, I think it becomes important to now build the enabling blocks, the structural blocks of support to help children to reach those standards. So a moment ago, I talked about a longer day and a longer year. Right now, in the state of New York, you can offer year-round schools if you would like, which I frankly favor, but you will simply not get state aid. If you offer it during the summer. You, in effect, are provided state aid based upon a 180-day school offering during the months of September through June. If you offer anything beyond that in other months, you're not entitled to state aid. That kind of policy shift is what's going to have to be done in order to enable New York City schools and things like that to really reach these standards. So again, it's one thing to hold out the standard and to say that this is important, and I would absolutely agree with those standards. I think the Commissioner is really right on the money about it. But it's another thing now to talk about those standards in light of what are the supports necessary for children in this system to reach those standards.
One of the things guiding my researchers, obviously, is a report I'm sure you may have heard of by the RAND Corporation, which found for math and science instruction for urban centers across the nation that mainly minority and poor children virtually get no supports in terms of those disciplines, that their teachers have never been trained in those disciplines, that they don't get the same kind of coursework and material, and they certainly don't get the kind of outcomes. How do we deal with this? What obviously the fear of many in the advocacy community around this is that they are going to come up with new standards, but they're not going to come up with the supporting wherewithal, a longer school year, top flight educators, all the rest, and that the graduation rate for high school students of color, which I think is as low as 20% in some schools, will get even worse, but now locked in as a perpetual sort of caste system. How do we make sure to push them both at the same time?
I think that's, I talked about earlier where I talked about there being some tension on the table.
Right.
The tension is that you have now a policy reconstruction without a fiscal reconstruction. You have an ability to set the tone theoretically about what children ought to be able to do, but you now need political currency, and you need staff development, and you need a whole host of things inside the system in order to build the capacity of the system to respond to that. And I think there's going to be a tension around that. My intent would be to push this agenda through advocacy, but also to push it in the parents' groups and in circles throughout the city of New York who basically argue that New York City is the benefactor of higher standards. The economy of New York is a benefactor of a stronger school system. Not just that we automatically end up seeing children having to go to school and get higher and receive higher levels of instruction, but that the whole city benefits from this. This is going to have to be a system where the city reinvests in this school system. And to the extent that there would be any tension at all, it would not be over whether to do that. It would be over how to do that. And I think it's my job as Chancellor to start bringing those voices together to sing, frankly, on the same page around the fact that our children deserve this.
You've had a very interesting 2 months or so of late after a honeymoon which was all too brief. You've taken tough stands on a number of issues, and I guess one of those, obviously, is your willingness to take over school districts that seem to be failing in one way or the other. I know there's been some back and forth in terms of court decisions, but what is your feeling about what the role of the chancellor is in terms of disciplining and overseeing school districts?
Well, I came in the door of the school system believing that any organization that is intending to produce a high-quality outcome has to be performance-driven. It has to focus on results. It has to be willing to help people achieve those results. And insofar as the question of school boards is concerned, I think going into schools and school districts where either by leadership or by lack thereof, there simply hasn't been the kind of results, there hasn't been the kind of outcome that we would want, and literally saying to them, the line is now drawn. You've had your opportunity. The data on the educational side would indicate that you've not been able to achieve those results. That enough is enough, and I think the system's got to learn how to say that, and it's got to mean it when it says it, and whether or not it be by virtue of corruption or whether it be by educational malfeasance, a child is not learning. And when that happens, this system ought to simply raise the roof.
And you intend to persist?
Absolutely.
The other thing you've come up with, put a shudder through constituencies I know, which is the notion of doing away with tenure for principals. I'd like to talk about the issue of tenure, both for principals and teachers. Where does this lead and why? I mean, it sounds real nice. Why not tenure for these guys?
Well, again, in a high-performance system, one in which you ultimately use data and you provide opportunities for that data to drive new and different decisions, and theoretically at least you create an environment in which people are performance and driven, you frankly would come up with a different mechanism of accountability. You would strengthen the system of accountability, and you wouldn't necessarily argue that one's, if you will, tenure is a function of time. It's more a function of performance. And I think we've got to really get to the point where we are talking about performance, and strictly performance. As a leader in a school system, or as a principal, or a person at that level, frankly, I think the vast majority of people in this and systems across the country have some outstanding leadership at the school site level. And these people are trying very much, in some cases against all odds, to achieve those results. But I think that it's time for us to recognize that the system really does need to help people to do that, and it needs to provide additional opportunities for them to do that, but when it does not happen, they need to be removed. And we need to be able to find a fairly fast and clean and honor-bound process by which to do that. And I don't think that one ought to have simple sort of property rights forever. I think that's separate from the issue of performance. It's separate from the issue of accountability. And I look forward to having the debate about that. I realize that that's a fairly tension-filled issue. But again, if you're serious about changing the system, you're going to have to talk about these things. These are not things you're going to be able to duck. It has to be put on the table.
Do you think the teachers are willing to have this discussion as well?
I think, frankly, as a management level, I differentiate what happens for a person who signs on as a manager as compared to that of a teacher in a classroom. I frankly think that that when you perform your functions in an organization as a part of a management team, that in effect you surrender your quote rights to simply having a way of holding on to that job forever. I think you ought to be willing to say that our performance, or the performance that I'm prepared to provide for this institution, will be at a maximum level. I expect a maximum support from this system, and to the extent that both of those things are on point, we've got a good outcome. To the extent that they are not, we need to know why not, and I think people ought to be entitled to a due process way in which they find out what happened and why it happened. But I think I differentiate what happens at the management level by comparison to that of the
I think as you talk to community groups, obviously, particularly in Black and Latino neighborhoods, there is some concern that even teachers who show themselves not particularly interested, or in the worst case, bigoted, aren't removed, that they have a tendency to stay no matter what. How do you go about maintaining their absolute right to protections, but at the same time protecting children when they're struggling?
See, everybody, my concern around this topic is that we all talk about these protections as though they are sacrosanct for adults. I keep wanting to say, if we're serious about a performance-driven system, let's protect the outcome. Let's describe what we expect to have happen for every child in the system, and then let's say that that's what's protected. And that if you want to guarantee me a permanent place in the organization, then let's guarantee me a permanent, win on the outcome side. Guarantee kids a permanent win. I just simply innately do not buy the notion that that the only way of people being protected, in effect, is by this mechanism. I think you've got to get rid of bad school boards, people who are making decisions about leadership placement of people and so forth based upon patronage. I think they ought to be gone. I would not see principals, and I think they're absolutely right on about the fact that, they do worry about the fact that boards are going to come in and make all kinds of wayward decisions about that. So I'm not persuaded that we're ever going to be able to get to a more performance-driven system until we get through these kinds of dialogues. Yeah.
What about the newest proposal, which is part of the law and order that is being actually, I think, proposed by and supported by a number of conservative and other legislators, that teachers would have the right to throw disruptive children out? As a disruptive child myself, though I of course hate to remember back that far, but certainly constantly questioning and making a best of myself, I'm clearly worried about minority children, some of them who are very bright and able, but pushing, that they'll be some of the first victims of some of the more arbitrary efforts under this. What is your attitude in terms of shifting this right to a classroom teacher?
Yeah.
Without
I don't really agree with that. I really think that there needs to be a different filter, that there needs to be a different question process or a questioning process. When children are struggling in school, they are struggling as learners. Our job as educators is to find out why they are struggling, and to the extent possible, get them relocated to the appropriate place where that struggle is mitigated or addressed. Some of those struggles have to do with their own self-concept. Some of those struggles have to do with fear. Some of those struggles have to do with the fact that they can't read and they're being asked to read. Some of those struggles have to do with the fact that they're absolutely bored. I mean, there can be any number of reasons. And I would say that as soon as we start creating a sort of a one best alternative, and that is you're out of here, you're on your own to some other place or wherever, I think you are going to have some very disproportionate uses of that kind of a policy, and I therefore don't favor it.
What about special education, which you're working on along with your staff? It clearly has been seen as a repository mainly for black men, young men. How is special education, how are you addressing that problem, which is seen as literally the ultimate dead end for young black or Hispanic males?
I think that, I mean, this is a sort of a sequel to the comment I just made, that in a spin, rinse, and wash cycle environment in which you almost, by behavior start to identify who can do it, who can't, who should be here, who shouldn't. I think you move away from a learner-centered mechanism, and you start using things like special education or Title I or other. You use them as permanent locations. You use them as permanent places for children who are thought of as being less able to do the work. I think that is exactly the wrong use of those programs. They are not permanent homes. They are services. And if you argue that those services should be available to children in need, then I think you would find that the services would be used differently, that they would be constructed differently, that the students' learning would be assessed differently in them, and so forth. But if in fact you argue that this is a place where it's the only place you can put them, because they have this, quote, propensity for acting out, or for whatever the case may be, all of a sudden you see the numbers swell, you see the costs swell, you see disproportionality represented in it, and so forth. And I think, to a large degree, what we're trying to do right now is really argue, first of all, that this is a service, not a location, and secondly, that we do need to really look at this from a program standpoint, not necessarily just from a financial standpoint. We need to look at these programs from a program standpoint and ask the question: how do children access these services? why are so many being placed, and particularly children of color, and specifically African American men and Latino men, young men? Why do they ultimately find themselves caught in that cycle? And to the extent possible, let's really quickly go about the business programmatically of finding other alternatives for them. Indeed, there may well be that they do not learn math or reading or some other discipline the same way. But this shouldn't be the only alternative that we provide for youngsters. There really ought to be other options, other opportunities for youngsters that, again, treat them as learners. I get very worried when I see people passing policies that really, in my mind, sort of are the sneak preview of little prisons in schools, where what we'll do is essentially send anybody who's bad, and bad gets to be sort of a generic term for you're just not learning right.
Along the same lines, but in a much broader issue, I get the sense, and perhaps as a layperson I'm not right, that this system, and perhaps most public systems, have always put forward the notion that the most resources that the system has should go towards an intellectual elite. That basically the child who looks like they're going to be on a college track or a higher ed track should get most of the resources. And I guess it becomes worrisome as I look at the bridge, for instance, leading for Stuyvesant High School, which I heard cost $13 million alone. And then I was at Principal for a Day a year or two ago at Prospect Heights, where the place clearly is in need of vast resources. And I'm wondering, is this just my perception that basically if you are in what's considered a less academic track, you're going to get the least of everything, and if you're, showing great academic potential, you're going to get everything? Is that right, or is that what's happening here?
What I think this organization, and let me just talk about it as a system, I think the system doesn't know how to do very well, is differentiate its response to children, or for that matter, to schools. So students who are in the process of really high levels of development, and there are many, countless numbers of children in this system that are receiving a fine quality education, that are in very top-notch schools, the best I've ever seen in the nation. The system doesn't know what to say. I mean, it doesn't necessarily reward them very much. It doesn't honor them very much. It doesn't hold them up as models. It doesn't know how to ultimately say, you know what, this is exactly what we're looking for. This is the A. This is the sort of theoretical A that we're trying to get, and we want to pronounce you an A student. I mean, the system doesn't have a way of clarifying that in a public way. On the other hand, it does know how to say, here's some problems that we have, and there are these schools or these children and so on and so forth. We have these SIR schools, we have SIR designations, we have registration review, we have all these things. I think we've got to be able to say something about both ends of this, and we've got to say it in a way that links them together as learners. These are schools and these are children who, by resource allocation, are very important, all of them. Maybe they needed a different resource allocation. That's indeed true. But they are clearly going to get what they need, not necessarily what a formula drives or what someone arbitrarily has determined that goes to that school, whatever that school may be. As I talk about longer day and longer year, frankly, that may be tremendously valuable for lots of students, but for different reasons.
Right.
So as a matter of building a new system, you start asking yourself, what do students need? And then you have to sort of peel back the next layer of that and say, which students and what do they need? But you're not arguing that some need it because they're just too slow and they won't be able to do it. You argue that they need it to catch up in some cases or to accelerate.
I still remember being at PS 138 in Crown Heights in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and in my third grade we had 6 or 7 substitute teachers, and the books were never delivered. And that was the awful 50s. The trouble, as you know as well as I do, you find some of the same patterns repeating themselves in very poor districts, some through mismanagement, some through the fact that many of these schools have the highest turnover. But again, getting back to the RAND Corporation report, we had indications, as best we could from the data we looked at, that the same pattern of lack of certified and highly skilled teachers, the sort of out-migration of those teachers from the worst neighborhoods in the city of New York, understandable, but still leaving the children there facing a triple whammy of trying to deal with all the pathologies that everyone likes to talk about, but having no hope of really making it academically because they don't have skilled practitioners necessarily in the same percentages that the more advantaged children do. And I guess this goes again trying to come up with an equity that's child-driven as you
Right,
go along.
right, absolutely.
One of the things, where would you like to be? I mean, you're now 8 months in, which is not fair, though you're, at this rate, given how we've gone through chancellors, you're starting to get seniority here of your own. What is your vision of how the system should look in 2 years, in 4 years, in 6 years, and then we give you a major gold star? But
well, the gold star, if there is ever to be one, is really to be shared, because if we're able to do this, the vision really is you will create a high-performance system. That is to say, a system that literally has, as a matter of routine, produced students who have a level of achievement, both in terms of their own personal adequacy, their own civic adequacy, their own academic adequacy, their own occupational adequacy, that they are routinely coming together and being developed in ways that virtually every school and every borough and every portion and every neighborhood would be very proud of. In order to do that, the things that you should start to see some evidence of the fact that we're moving in that is you should see some tension. You should, in fact, see some organizational tension around some of these issues that I was talking about earlier. That tension ought to produce dialogue. That dialogue ought to engage people who heretofore have not felt as though they've had any opportunity for the dialogue. Parents ought to be a significant part of that dialogue. Community at large, the business community, health and human service communities, university communities, et cetera, all ought to be part of the dialogue. You ought to see a differentiation in the way in which schools get handled, the way in which their performance gets recognized. Schools that are low performing and struggling will be watching and monitoring and giving some greater control, giving some greater direction over those schools from my office. That's through the Chancellor's District. You ought to start to also see the building of a different accountability system for all of us, a different way of being able to assess whether student learning is taking place, different mechanisms by which to support student learning in after school and after regular school year times. Those are things we're going to see more of. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Crew. Not too long ago, New York City's public schools were among the finest in the nation. Some still are. But somewhere along the line, we allowed politics to blur the focus on many of our schools. We need to regain that focus. Schools are not about jobs for adults or payoffs for supporters. They're about children learning. Parents and all concerned citizens must make sure our elected representatives understand that we demand nothing less. This is David R. Jones for the Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.